Hi, I'm Sarah Hart from Drive Hart, and today I'm joined by Cass, who's a Drive Hart PDI. Hi, Cass.
Hiya.
Hello, and Julie as well, the other director.
Oh, hi.
So what we're going to do today is talk to Cass about the Part 3 test and explore her worries and her concerns. So, Cass, would you like to kick off and tell us exactly what it is you're feeling about your Part 3 that's coming up?
Yeah, so I'm a bit nervous. There's a couple of questions that I'd like to go over, really. The big one being, how can I actually pass?
Well, that's a good question. So, yeah, great question to start off with. How can you pass your Part 3? Well, first of all, you need to know the SC1, which is the recording form that the senior instructor will be using. But I don't think we need to go into too much detail. But are you familiar with the SC1, Cass?
Yes.
Yeah? You know what it's all about, and you know the 3 different sections in the SC1?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Just
good.
a quick recap on that. In terms of the SC1, that's the marking criteria. It's published online by DVSA, and it has a number of competencies: lesson planning, risk management, teaching and learning strategies, with subdivisions beneath it. And that's basically how you're marked in a Part 3 exam. Full details of that are on the DVSA How to Become a Driving Instructor, so you can have a look at that. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the thing about a Part 3 is rather than just thinking about the high competencies in the SC1, it's thinking about the lesson as a whole, because you need to have a holistic approach to taking a lesson with the student. So in terms of the student you choose, that's important because you want to have a student that communicates well with you. And you've got a few students out on the go, haven't you?
Yeah.
Cass?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, so you find your lessons with those students that you communicate well with much easier, I should think.
Yeah, and it flows and there's good communication. So they're then happy to give answers if there's questions. When you do Q&A,
Yep.
yeah, they'll be more responsive with what answers they're prepared to.
Yeah, so it makes your life easier, doesn't it, as an instructor? Okay, good. Well, I mean, you've brought up communication there, actually. And communication is probably one of the top things that as an instructor you need to be good at. So particularly in your Part 3, you've got 40 minutes to show the examiner that you're communicating well with the student. Now, if your student is a non-communicator, probably you're not going to have them as your number one choice to take them to test. But, you know, sometimes people on test who are normally quite communicative will suddenly dry up. And I think we've seen that in various sort of Part 3s and standards checks, haven't we?
Yeah, and I think it's really important to understand that communication is a two-way thing, because if you're good rapport with your student, but you also need to be able to listen, see what's happening with the student in the circumstances you're in on that day. Because somebody who previously is a really good communicator can suddenly dry up, and it's about listening and adapting and responding to what's happening with that student. So listening skills are quite key as well, and not being scared to adapt and respond to what's happening in the car at that time. So not following a preset plan, but responding and adapting. And I think that's how they phrase it in the SC1. That you have the confidence to be able to look and see what's going on with the student and therefore match what they need at that time.
Yeah, so making sure that the lesson is suitable for the student is really important. But as Julie says, you might have to change the lesson plan. And in terms of adapting the lesson plan, Cass, would you feel comfortable that you know what they're looking for with that?
Yeah, so that was going to be another question, when to adapt, and equally how long to pull up, I suppose. So if you need to adapt, would that classify it as a stop, and how long you would need to stop for?
Yes, good question. And a lot of people worry about this. So if you have to adapt the lesson completely and reset your goals, it's probably going to be because something quite fundamental has gone wrong. So let's take, for example, somebody who's in a manual car and they normally remember to pop it into rolling first at the end of the road. And then suddenly today on your Part 3, they've set you a curveball and they keep forgetting. They've forgotten once to pop it into first, so they've chubbed out in second. You'd have surely mentioned it because you've seen it, so you'd mention it. And then they've done it again. Now, at this point, you're going to have to stop Probably. I mean, there's nothing is written in tablets of stone, but probably at this point I'll be thinking, right, it's happened twice. I need to address this with my student and think about how we can remind the student that they need to pop it into first and the consequences of not doing so, and coming up with a remedy. How are we going to rectify it? So that's your fault identification process, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
It's nothing other than that. But then if they continue to do it, so if your goals had originally been, I don't know, looking at planning and anticipation in terms of meeting traffic, you're now going to have to think, okay, the meeting traffic sort of might have to go out of the window for a bit. We need to get this end of the road procedure sorted out. So you might have to just change your lesson goals, just maybe even temporarily. But there's nothing wrong with doing that. And in the situation where they've done it 3 times, I would definitely recommend, wouldn't you, Julie, that they need to change the goals.
Yeah, definitely.
And reset.
And basically, it's what you would normally do in your lessons, where you would talk to your student about the issue that's just arisen. And resetting goals is no more than actually agreeing how you're going to address that with them. So that's a short communication between the two of you about, I think we need to focus on this, if they agree, and have a chat about that if they don't, if they want to do roundabouts, and as opposed to adapting the plan and doing, it could be mirrors or something. So the key for me is it's about effective communication throughout the lesson with your student, that you're listening and looking to see what they're actually doing and how they're responding throughout the lesson, and how you have to adapt the plan in order to meet their needs as the lesson is progressing. So you can, almost you can expect that you would be adapting the plan in every lesson, because most students, there's something emerges what you've got to address. And it's about making sure that there is a shared responsibility with you and the student to agreeing what needs to be addressed.
But that doesn't mean, though, that every time something goes wrong, you have to change your lesson goals, because it might even be a small blip that's happened that you can even talk about on the move. Maybe they've just brought the clutch up too fast and you've got the cough of the engine. That's something simple, or a mirror check that's been missed. You might be able to have a conversation with them on the move. And you've done that. I've seen you do that lots of times, Cass, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if the road ahead's clear, there's nothing going on, there's no reason why you can't have that on the go. If something then was to happen, just drop it. And
yeah, good. And a good little thing I heard somebody say the other day is, are you okay if we just talk about that on the move? And that's a fantastic way of getting that student's okay and permission to say, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that now. But as you quite rightly say, Cass, if something kicks off ahead of you, then drop that conversation straight away, deal with what's happening ahead and come back to it at a later time.
So just to recap, we've talked about the importance of communication and listening skills and being able to respond and adapt to what the students' needs are. And that really is the key to success. So come back to your first question, is how can I pass? Is first and foremost, get to understand what competency the DVSA examiner is looking for. And that's really well documented in the ADI1 and the SC1. The DVSA have given some examples in the ADI1, which is the guidance to examiners, that gives examples of some actions that are competent, and it gives examples of lack of competency. So they're really good. That's a good heads up as to what they're looking for. The SC1 breaks down what they're looking for under a number of headings, principally lesson planning, risk management, and teaching learning strategies, but it does dig deeper into that. So get to know the exam well, but also understand that principally the importance of building that good communication between your student, where you're operating on an adult-to-adult basis, that you are ensuring that the student builds a sense of responsibility for their learning.
And that actually comes into the risk management section as well, doesn't it?
Yeah.
When you're talking about the responsibility. Cass, are you aware of the section of risk management? You know that it exists?
yeah, is that the one that you can fail for if you don't hit a certain mark?
That's right, yeah. If you get 7 or less in risk management alone, then that is a fail, no matter how well you've done across the board with the other sections. If you've got 7 or less in risk management, you're going to fail. So risk management, is it a good time to talk about risk management? Are we okay to have that conversation?
Risk management really has got 2 sides to it. And I think we've discussed this before in terms of there is the side where you have to manage the learning environment, manage the risks and issues because you're in a car on the open highway. But that's about you watching the student and keeping you and the student and other road users safe. The other side of it is about building your students' capability to manage and deal with risks so they become independent. And that, if you view it in those two ways, you can actually see in the SC1 how that is marked, in terms of appropriate interventions, about giving timely instructions. So that's all about, actually understanding what's happening in the environment and managing it effectively with the student. Sarah?
Yeah, and to add to that, still under risk management is, was the instructor aware of everything that's happening around them? That's not only with the student, what's happening in the car, but it's what's happening outside of the car. And I think a lot of PDIs go into their part 3 thinking, okay, my student's going to do independent driving. And the feeling is that because that is the goal that's been set, that they're going to drive independently, the instructor can't intervene. And what tends to happen is they're charging into all sorts of hazards and problems, and the instructor's sitting back thinking, well, they're driving independently. I can't say anything. And Cass, as somebody that's been out on the road teaching already, you will know, won't you, that there's plenty of times when you've got to be looking really well ahead. You spot things happening. What do you do?
So that would be the point that you've identified what's happening ahead, and then you kind of look to your student to see what their reaction is. If there is no reaction, then it may be a case of prompting questions, or maybe actually telling them then what to do. It depends on the situation and how it needs to be dealt with, really.
Brilliant. And what the key thing that you said is I'm looking well ahead and I've spotted the problem, and then I'm going to react in an appropriate way. And an appropriate way is not to let the student come rushing into it when you know they're not up to dealing with it. So that's your sort of level of instruction, and that's about keeping the lesson safe throughout. But equally, if you've got a student who's relatively capable and you're constantly getting hold of the steering wheel or dabbing the brake, that's going to be over instruction and over interference, isn't it, with the dual controls, and possibly, over verbalizing help when actually they need to be let loose a little bit. So it's trying to find that balance, isn't it?
And there's some basic things is that a lot of time we see feedback where the level of support hasn't matched what the student needs. So if you've got somebody who's having real issues and you're allowing it to continue and you're not actually getting actively involved in supporting the student, then obviously that can get marked in risk management. So it's about the right level of support. It's about watching your student, watching what's happening in the environment. And actually, I think it's probably one of the hardest skill sets to learn is how you can watch what's going on outside the car as well as watching what's going on in the car and putting that together so that you keep you and the student safe and you're still using it for learning. So I would say that's probably one of the challenges in terms of increasing your skill set. But the worst thing you can do is to sit there as a passenger in the instructor's seat. Because if you do that, the student undoubtedly at some point will struggle. And if you are not helping and supporting and probing and questioning, then how are they building their skills to deal with risks and hazards? So it's really important. Equally, the other side of it is I've seen performances where people have battered the student with questions when they're about to negotiate a really serious junction. So you've got to watch that your keenness to ask questions and probe and get involved with the student is done at the appropriate time as well, so that it doesn't distract them. Okay. I think risk management, is there any other issues around risk management?
Well, other than, as we've said before, that it's got to flow throughout the lesson, inside the car, outside the car, from you, from your student. It's, it's a holistic thing again, isn't it, in risk management?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So any other key subjects that you wanted us to touch on?
Cass, you go.
Yeah, no, you go.
I think knowledge as well. I think it's very easy to get caught out in a part 3 because you don't have the correct amount of knowledge. And this is knowledge that we're talking about that stems from your theory test when you're starting to do your revision, all of those things about the rules of the road, the highway code, the ins and outs of everything. There's nothing worse on a part 3 than your student asks you a question about a road sign or the sequence of a light or whatever, and you don't know the answer. That's an absolute crash and burn.
Yeah, and it
So
becomes
keep
very
knowledge.
evident in your exam if your technical knowledge isn't right up there. So, for example, a classic one with myself was spotting the issue of coasting and understanding that how to unpack that with a student. Other good examples. I'm just
Oh,
trying to think.
if you're in the city, you know, the difference between pelican, puffin, toucan, you know, all of those little things, you know, what do the road markings mean? You've got to be absolutely on it. And you've got to answer your students' questions as well. And that's all about, again, having those communication skills with your student. But what I would say, I heard a senior examiner say this to a group of people the other day, you know, if it's all going really badly wrong because your student is not performing at the level that they would normally perform, don't worry, deal with it, because the examiner in the back can also see that it's falling apart. So it's not that the student's falling apart that's the problem, it's what you do to deal with it. And, you know, a senior examiner actually said that to us the other day. Don't worry, we can see what you're seeing. So, you know, don't worry about that.
Yeah, I think the only thing is, do you have any issues around the format of the day or the format of the test at all?
It's just knowing, say, when to pull up, if you can pull up, how long it's going to last for.
Yeah, so you've spotted an issue and you want to unpack it, that kind of scenario.
Okay, and again, that's a great question because a lot of people think, oh my goodness, because of what my examiner said to me at the beginning, I'm not allowed to stop. So what the examiner is saying is, you know, if you do need to pull up to unpack a situation, then please feel free to do so, but keep it to a minimum. And the reason they're asking you to do that is that they don't want to sit for 20 minutes listening to you, delivering a briefing or going through a situation. They want to see you with a wheels rolling lesson, how you react, how you respond, what your students doing, because it's dynamic and they can see all your skills coming out there. They can't see much skill with you sitting at the side of the road. So if a situation occurs and you need to stop, then please do stop. Keep it pithy. Make sure you dig in enough detail, but not so much that he's sitting in the back thinking, oh, goodness, we really need to get going now. And that's sort of the balance again, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, does that help with that question?
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you.
Okay. So are there any other sort of burning issues, Cassie, you'd like us to touch on in terms of the part 3? Okay. I'd like to introduce one just before we finish, and that's about when you're actually going for your part 3, I would definitely encourage you to have your trainer in the back observing what happens. And I know some people have different views about this, but I think it's really important because you can then get a debrief with your trainer whilst you're waiting for the test result, but you can also get a longer debrief if the test result is unfortunate and you haven't passed. It's really important to use that as a learning experience. And it's very hard to try to do that on your own, particularly when you've been in exam, you know, the pressure of the exam. So the kind of recommendations I would do is always take your trainer to observe the test. Get the trainer to give you some feedback immediately after the test whilst you're waiting the results, because usually they can see what the hot issues are. I think that's right, isn't it, Sarah?
Yeah.
And do a longer, what I call a sort of a hot debrief with the trainer the day after or as soon as possible after the event, so that you can actually capture that learning of what went on, whether it was successful or not. I think that's quite important.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that, you know, even if you've passed, which hopefully you will, the SEs give you really good feedback. They'll give you some really helpful tips, what went well, what you could have done better. Because, you know, they're going to be then saying, well, you might get called in for a standards check. So this isn't the end result, passing your part 3. This is a step on the way. But they're always really good at giving you helpful feedback. So, you know, whichever way it goes, listen to that feedback. It's gold dust.
And just in terms of the format, are you clear about how long they expect you to open the session?
Is it 3 minutes?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worthwhile just touching on the format of the test itself. And
yeah, so as you'll meet and greet the examiner in the test centre, we usually take the student in with us. That's just what we do. Some people leave them in the car. I think it's better to take them in. Then the student will get sent off to the car, and the examiner will have a chat with you about your student. So you give them a couple of minutes info on your student, and then they'll ask you what the lesson is all about today. So that's when you set out what the goals of the lesson are, what subject you're looking to teach. And then that'll be it. They'll then give you the time that they want you to arrive back at the test centre. And I'd always suggest you write that down, because if you're anything like me, as soon as you've driven out of the test centre, it'll have gone out of your head. So you hop in the car, and then you've got about 2 to 3 minutes just to recap with your student what the aim is for the next 40 minutes. Because you'll have picked up the student from home earlier before you arrived at the test centre. You'd have probably had half an hour, an hour's lesson. So all you're doing at this point is recapping the goals for the lesson. For the case of the examiner, for sure, but also for your students, so they know what the plan is for the next 40 minutes, and then it's still relevant, because if that's changed in the lead up to the test, then you might need to change what you're going to do, and that goes straight back to the being flexible, doesn't it?
Yeah, and then you can expect a 40 minutes drive.
40 minutes drive.
Now, normally we would say that if you're using the approach of chunking, that you're expecting to pull over at least once or twice during that session to unpack something or check out with your student, depending on what's happening in the car. Really important that you respond to what's happening in the car, not just what you had planned with the student in the session before. And then make sure you get back to the test centre with a couple of minutes to spare, so that you can actually do a debrief with them, with the instructor, the examiner in the back, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the purpose of the debrief is to, let's just quickly review the lesson. What went well? Yeah. What did you find challenging? What did you learn? That's a really good question, because you need to discuss what they've learned, because if you don't get any learning outcomes, then you haven't done a great job, because, that's the whole point in the lesson. So we quite often recommend you ask for the top 3 takeaways from the lesson from the student. And it's not necessarily always going to be a positive takeaway. It might be something that went wrong. But the good news is that you've highlighted it with them. They've highlighted it. So you'd carry that through to your next lesson. So that's it.
Yeah.
Really.
So we've covered quite a few subjects there. We've covered communication, the importance of good communication with your student, listening and responding and adapting to what their needs are during the lesson. We've talked about how to manage your nerves and the students' nerves, and that's making sure that you are actually responding to what's happening with them and checking out with them regularly. We've also covered the format of the test, and I'm just thinking risk management in a little bit more detail. So as always, if there's anything else anybody is interested in discussing, you can get in touch with Drive Hart via WhatsApp on 07919 488 360. And unless anybody's got any final questions, we'll conclude the podcast.
No longer.
Thanks, Cass, for coming in and helping us today with that. It's great.
So, Cass, can I just ask you before we finish the podcast, what are your top takeaways from today?
So my top takeaways from today is with the SC1, it's looking at it as a whole. It's looking at it as the whole lesson, being mindful of the fact that your pupil is
So it's a holistic approach for the lesson. Yeah, rather than looking at the SC1 in individual lines of trying to achieve that particular thing, it's looking at the lesson as a whole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then having good communication with your pupil, being fully aware of the surroundings, what the pupil's doing, what's happening outside the car. Equally knowing when to support them more, when to slightly step back a little bit and let them have more responsibility for their learning. Briefs. So again, it needs to be the pupil speaking as opposed to myself or another instructor. So you're actually then getting their perspective on what their goals are, and then what they've learned at the end of the lesson.
Yeah, that's really important to hear the student's voice, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that was thank you for that. That's really useful to see what you've got out of tonight's session. So with that, I'm going to say good evening.
Great. Thank you very much, ladies.
Thank you.